On a creek in the 40-mile country in the winter of 1952, it is 40 below outside, and the wall beside the cabin door holds 4 things. Closest to the latch hangs a bolt-action rifle, iron sights, the bluing worn to gray along the carry points. Beside it, a pump 12 gauge with a rifled slug in the chamber and buckshot behind it. Then a Hudson's Bay handaxe, a 2-pound head on a 28-inch handle. The edge filed bright that morning. Then a rack of steel traps hanging by their chains, boiled and smoked over spruce, so they carry no smell of the house. The order is the order a man would reach for them. The rifle is for the moose that fills the cache, a 1,600-pound animal that is 500 pounds of winter meat. The shotgun is for the brown bear at the woodpile at 10 feet in the dark, an animal that stands 9 feet when it rises. The axe is for the problem with no teeth at all, the cold that kills faster than anything that walks. The traps are for the wolves and lynx that follow the line, and for the fur that is the only cache this ground produces. The family holds the ground under the Homestead Act, a quarter section nobody else ever filed on, and the winter that closed the country in October will hold it shut for 8 months. Every object on the wall passed the same examination. It did at least 3 jobs. It survived being dropped through the ice, and it could be repaired at the bench under the window with a file and a piece of wire. Not everything that passed hangs by the door. In the kitchen there is a curved knife the Yupik were making 4,000 years before the rifle's factory existed. And in the cache there is a coil of moose hide line that works at temperatures where steel springs go brittle. The family uses all of it, and has never once sorted it into native and bought. The wall holds 4. The full inventory runs to 25, and the oldest piece on it comes first. Number 25, the ulu. The oldest piece is a knife, and it does not look like one. The blade is a shallow half-moon of steel set at right angles to a short handle of antler, bone, or wood, and it cuts with a rocking press of the whole arm, a downward roll that puts the body's weight behind the edge instead of the wrist. Inupiat and Yupik women had been using the form for at least 4,000 years before the first steamer came up the coast, and it survived because it does one job better than any straight blade ever made. It strips fat and flesh from a hide without cutting through the skin. That distinction is not cosmetic. A hide cut through is a hide that will not keep anyone warm. Homesteading families on the Kuskokwim and the Seward Peninsula learned the tool from their neighbors within a single season, trading flour and tea for a blade cut from a worn-out saw and fitted to a caribou antler grip. Women on the Bering Coast could clean a seal hide with an ulu faster than a man could sharpen his sheath knife. The one that hung in a homestead kitchen was almost never bought. It was made, and it was made to fit one hand. Number 24, the babiche snare. Babiche is rawhide line, and the Athabascan method of making it was a single cut, one continuous spiral taken from a green moose or caribou hide, then wet, stretched, and dried until it held like cable. Set on a rabbit run through the willows or a lynx trail through the spruce, it did what no factory product on this list could do, because it worked in the one condition where nothing mechanical does. At 50 below, steel springs go brittle, and a trigger sealed in ice will not release. A loop of babiche has no spring to snap, no trigger to freeze, no moving part at all, and it caught meat on mornings when a steel trap was a decoration. A single moose hide yielded hundreds of feet of line, so the price was labor and nothing else, and in a cash-poor country, that was the whole point. In the Tanana Valley, children ran lines of 40 snares before school through the winter of 1940, and in a bad year, the snowshoe hare that came off those lines was the only meat in the house between Christmas and breakup. Number 23, the Athabascan deadfall. The deadfall took the same logic one step further and removed the line too. The trap was built entirely of what was standing within 20 feet of the set, 2 uprights, a trigger, and a weight of spruce logs or a flat stone propped so that the animal pulling at the bait drops the whole load onto its own back. Nothing about it was written down. The build passed hand to hand, and what passed with it was the critical part. The trigger notch, cut so fine that a marten's pull would release it, and a jay landing on it would not. That notch is engineering as exact as anything in a rifle action. It simply happens to be cut in green wood. The trap cost nothing, could be built anywhere in the timber, and was rebuilt in place after every catch. A trapper could run 100 of them across a drainage while carrying no equipment at all. On the middle Yukon, there were old men who could set a deadfall in under 4 minutes with nothing but a handaxe, and who considered the store-bought steel traps a poor trade for the money they cost. It is hard to argue with that accounting. The steel trap cost money. The deadfall cost 4 minutes. Number 22. The bola. On the coast, the same arithmetic pointed at the sky. Twice a year, the waterfowl migrations came through the Seward Peninsula. Enormous movements of ducks and geese in spring and fall, and a flock passing low over a spit could feed a family for a week, if the family could reach it. The Inupiat answer was 3 to 6 weights of bone, ivory, or stone, on a bundle of braided sinew lines, thrown overhead into the flight so that the lines wrap the birds in the air and bring them down. The tool was cheap, and cheap is not the same as crude. A shotgun did the same work faster, but a shotgun shell cost money nobody had, and homesteaders on that coast picked up the bola for exactly that reason. In the years when a box of shells had to come in by boat and the boat came twice a summer, oral histories from Norton Sound describe men who carried a bola coiled around the crown of a hat, ready in one motion, and they remember the sound of it, the whistle of the weights going up that told the whole camp supper had arrived. The shells stayed in the tin by the stove. The birds came down anyway. Number 21, the leister. The rivers demanded the same precision the sky did. A leister is a fish spear with a center spike and 2 springing side prongs of antler or steel, shaped so that a salmon is gripped against the point rather than merely pierced, because a fish that is only pierced tears free on the lift, and on the Copper, the Kuskokwim, and 100 smaller streams, the lift was everything. The salmon runs were the single event that decided whether a homestead ate through the following winter, a few weeks of moving water that had to become a rack of dried fish before the light went. The tool asked almost nothing in return. A homesteader could forge the prongs from a wagon tire or a barrel hoop in an afternoon, and the shaft came out of the nearest spruce stand. Families in the Copper River country put up several hundred fish in a season with a leister and a drying rack, working from a plank platform or a gravel bar in shifts through the light nights of July, because everyone on the platform understood the terms. A run missed was a winter lost. Nothing in the inventory so far has involved gunpowder. The country was being held with antler, rawhide, spruce, and sinew, and held competently. The factory guns, when they arrive, have a great deal to live up to. Number 20, the took. The ice chisel of the Arctic is a heavy iron blade socketed onto a long wooden shaft and driven straight down with both hands, and its job is to open a fishing hole through 5 feet of river ice. That sentence deserves a moment because the arithmetic under it is the arithmetic of the whole winter. A family with a hole in the ice has fresh fish from November to breakup. A family without one has no protein at all. The chisel also pried, tested, and defended. A pry bar for a frozen cache lid, a sounding rod for bad ice, and a weapon against a dog gone wrong on the chain. Blacksmiths in Fairbanks and Nome forged them for a few dollars apiece, and a good blade was reforged and resharpened for decades until the iron stood at half its original length and was still working. The men who ran dog teams across the interior tested every foot of doubtful river ice ahead of the team with the chisel, a habit with a reason behind it. The ice that looks solid over a spring hole has killed more people in Alaska than every bear on this list combined. Number 19. The toggling harpoon. It is the most sophisticated hunting mechanism in the Arctic, and one of the great engineering objects of any pre-industrial people. The head detaches from the shaft. It passes through the skin of a seal, and then turns sideways beneath it, locking from the inside, so the animal cannot shake it loose. Not a barb, a mechanism, a piece of geometry that converts the animal's own pull into a tighter hold. Inupiat hunters had been refining it for thousands of years before any ship arrived, and it is the reason coastal life was possible at all, because a seal struck and lost under the ice is a seal that fed no one. When coastal homesteaders and traders took the design up, they changed the material and nothing else. Steel where slate and ivory had been, and the toggle geometry exactly as they found it because there was nothing in it to improve. The accounts from the Chukchi coast describe hunters who waited motionless at a breathing hole for hours in wind that froze eyelids shut, and the harpoon each man trusted was the one he had taken apart and rebuilt himself that autumn, because a tool bet against the ice was rebuilt every year. Number 18, the Hudson's Bay axe. The trapper's hand axe carries a head of roughly 2 pounds on a 28-inch handle, which is the compromise worked out over 2 centuries of the fur trade, light enough to ride on a trap line all day, heavy enough to fell a spruce for a night's fire, and fire is why it stands this high on the list. In a country where hypothermia kills faster than anything with teeth, the tool that makes fire is the tool that saves the life, and a man separated from his axe in January was a man in serious trouble. At a trading post in 1900, the pattern sold for about $2.50, and a head outlived a dozen handles, each one carved at the cabin bench from a birch billet through the dark months. Trappers in the 40 Mile and the Kaitina crossed every creek with the axe on a loop of line around the wrist, and the reasoning was flat. A man may lose a pack in the water and live. He cannot lose an axe in the water and live. Everything else on the sled was replaceable by spring. The axe was replaceable by nothing closer than a week's travel. Number 17, the Green River sheath knife. It was forged at the Green River Works in Massachusetts, carried across the entire American frontier, and arrived in Alaska in the packs of the stampeders of 1898. And then, it simply never left. 25 cents bought one at a trading post at the turn of the century, cheap enough for men who had spent everything they owned on the passage north. What it did was everything a thin blade can do. It skinned, it boned, it gutted. It cut rope, whittled trap triggers, shaved kindling for the fire the axe had made possible, and it took an edge on a flat creek stone in a country where nobody owned a grinding wheel. There was no ceremony in it and no pattern name pride. It was the knife, the way the file was, the file. Traders on the Yukon River posts remembered men who had worn a Green River blade down to a narrow sliver over 20 winters and refused every offer of a new one. And the refusal was not sentiment. A man cutting frozen meat in bad light wants a blade whose behavior he knows completely. They knew exactly how the old one cut, and that was worth more than new steel. Number 16, the snow knife. The pana is a long, thick, single-edged blade of bone, antler, or steel, and its work is cutting blocks of wind-packed snow for a shelter that a man caught in the open can raise in under an hour. It belongs on a list of survival weapons for one reason. On a night at 50 below with a wind running, the thing that kills is not a bear, and a snow shelter with a single candle burning in it holds a temperature a man survives until morning. Homesteaders learned the technique from Inupiat neighbors, and some learned it from One Bad Night, which is a slower school with the same curriculum. The knife rode in the sled, not the pack, and the distinction mattered because a sled overturned in the dark in a rising wind is precisely the moment the blade is needed, and a tool buried in a pack under lashed freight might as well be in Seattle. Travelers caught out on the Arctic coast cut shelters in 40 minutes, sat out storms that ran 3 days, and did not travel without the blade again. 40 minutes of work bought 3 days of life, and few tools on this list state their case that plainly. Number 15. The new house number 4. The tools so far kept a family alive. The steel trap kept it solvent. The number 4 was the wolf and lynx trap out of the Oneida community works in New York. Double spring, offset jaws, with a spread wide enough to hold an animal that will chew through anything smaller. And it arrived in Alaska as the working machinery of the only reliable cash economy a homestead had. Fur was the crop. Fur paid for the flour. Fur paid for the ammunition. Fur paid for the stove. And a good lynx pelt in the 1920s brought more than a week's wages in the States. The traps themselves were bought a few at a time, at roughly $2.50 apiece in 1910, a real sum, spread across several seasons until a line was long enough to pay. On the Tanana and the Koyukuk, the men who ran those lines went out by dog team on circuits of 70 miles in 10 days, sleeping in line cabins spaced a day's travel apart, and nobody counted animals. A season was measured in the weight of the fur bundle at the end of it, because the bundle was the year's income, and everything else was subsistence. Number 14, the new house number 6. The number 4's enormous relative was a different proposition entirely. The number 6 was the bear trap. Double spring steel, more than 40 pounds of it, jaws spanning 16 inches. And at $15 to $20 it stood as the single most expensive object in most trapping outfits. Nobody set it for fur. It went in at a cache or a smokehouse where a brown bear had already come once, for the plain reason that a bear that has found a food cache will come back until something stops it. On the Kenai and on Kodiak, homesteads lost an entire winter's meat to a single bear in one night, and that is the context in which a family spends $20 on a trap in a year when it earns almost nothing. Setting one required a clamp and 2 men, and everyone who used one understood the bargain that came with it. The trap was as dangerous to the family as to the animal. Children and dogs were caught in them, and no one who owned a number 6 pretended otherwise. It hung high on the cabin wall, jaws closed, out of any reach but a grown man's. It was respected the way the bear was respected. Number 13, the wire snare. At the other end of the scale, from 40 pounds of steel, was a coil of wire that cost pennies a yard. Soft brass, or annealed steel, sold by the coil at any trading post, twisted into a running loop and hung on a lynx trail or a rabbit run, the cheapest effective hunting technology on this list. Its advantage over the steel trap was weight. A trapper could carry 200 snares in a coat pocket and only a dozen traps on a sled, and in a country measured in miles of travel, that ratio decided how much ground a family could work. Wire also answered a specifically Alaskan problem. A steel set buried under a foot of new snow overnight was a set that caught nothing, and a snare hung at head height on a trail stayed exactly where it was put. On the upper Yukon, the division of labor in many families was fixed. The steel trap line was the adults' work, and the wire snare line belonged to the children, who ran short loops close to the cabin every day instead of long circuits every 10. The children brought in more animals, and nobody found it strange. In that country, wire in a child's pocket was income. Number 12, the Colt Single Action Army. Here the list turns from animals to people. The Colt was the .45 caliber revolver of the American West, and it came up the inside passage in 1898 in the belts of men who had already used one somewhere else, the first serious handgun in the territory. On the trail to Dawson, it was carried less for bears than for the 100,000 men moving through country with almost no law in it, a fact the mounted police understood well enough that they registered every firearm crossing the summit of the Chilkoot. A new one sold for around $17, and second-hand ones changed hands in Skagway and Daya for whatever the seller could get when the money ran out, and the money ran out constantly. The stampede accounts hold both ends of that transaction. There were men who sold the revolver before they sold the boots. And there were men who kept it 30 years afterward in a cabin in the 40 Mile. The bluing gone entirely to gray. A gun that had crossed the pass in 1898 and outlasted the rush, the trail, and most of the men who walked it. It was never the best tool on the wall. It was the oldest story on it. Number 11, the Stampeder's pocket revolver. Below the Colt sat something far more common and far less useful. The small nickel-plated break-top revolvers in .32 and .38 caliber, Iver Johnson, Harrington, and Richardson, and a dozen makers nobody remembers, went north by mail order at $3 to $6 apiece, in the coats of tens of thousands of men who had never owned a gun before. They were nearly useless against anything large. And they were carried anyway because a man with everything he owned in one pack, in a tent city of 10,000 strangers, wanted something in his coat. The assessment on the trail was immediate and unanimous, and it deserves to be repeated exactly as it stood. A pocket revolver would not stop a bear. It would not reliably stop a man. Its real function was to be sold in Dawson for the price of a meal. At Nome in 1900, where 40,000 people lived on the sand for a single season, the little revolvers changed hands constantly and were fired mostly by accident. That is the whole record, and it is not a distinguished one. The men who carried them said as much at the time. They bought them anyway. Number 10, the Winchester Model 1897. John Browning's exposed hammer pump was the first pump shotgun that genuinely worked, and it became the single most useful firearm a homestead could own, because a 12-gauge handles more of Alaska than any rifle does. One gun covered ptarmigan and grouse in the willows. One gun covered the ducks and geese coming down on the migration and the snowshoe hare in the spruce. One gun, loaded with buckshot or a slug, covered the bear that came to the woodpile in the dark. One purchase answered most of what the country would ask. It listed at about $25 in 1900, and the takedown version broke into two pieces that fit a pack or a sled box, a feature that mattered more in Alaska than anywhere else Winchester sold it. The Matanuska colony, the 200 families brought north from Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota in 1935, was plain about how the arrangement worked. The shotgun was the gun the family actually used, and the rifle was the gun that hung on the wall, waiting for something serious. Most winters, nothing serious came, and the shotgun worked every week regardless. Number 9, the .22 rimfire. It looks wrong at first, a boy's rifle ranked above the Colt, until the arithmetic is on the table, and the arithmetic is the whole argument. The Winchester Model 62, the Remington Model 12, the Stevens favorite, and a dozen small rifles like them sold for between $4 and $16, and they put more meat on Alaska homestead tables than every large caliber rifle combined. A box of 50 cartridges cost about 15 cents and weighed almost nothing, and 15 cents at a time it took the snowshoe hare, the ptarmigan, the spruce grouse, and the porcupine that a family in the interior actually ate day to day, because a moose is an event and supper is a schedule. The same rifle did the quiet work at the end of the trap line, because a large caliber bullet ruins the pelt that pays for the winter, and a .22 to the head does not. On the Kenai and the Susitna, boys of 9 and 10 were handed the rifle and a counted number of cartridges, and were expected to come home with more animals than rounds fired. They did. Whole winters of small meat came home a cartridge at a time. The little rifle kept the table set through 8 months of dark. Filling the cache was a different problem. Number 8, the Winchester Model 1894. The answer was a lever action in .30-30 that came north with the rush and stayed for a century. And the reasons it stayed were never in the catalog copy. It was light, it lay flat against the body, and it was quick to work with mittens on, no small consideration at 40 below. New, it was an $18 rifle in 1895. By the 1920s, used ones were everywhere in the territory at half that, and half price put a real rifle inside the reach of families proving up on nothing. For moose inside 200 yards it was entirely enough, and moose is the animal the whole calculation turns on. A single bull yields 500 pounds of meat. 500 pounds, cut and hung and frozen at the cache, is the difference between a family that eats until breakup and a family that does not. In the Susitna Valley, there were homesteaders who took every moose of their lives with the same Model 1894, and who considered the argument about better cartridges a conversation for people with money. The rifle killed moose, the moose filled the cache, and the rest was talk. Number 7. The Krag Jorgensen. And then the Army changed its mind, and Alaska got a rifle out of it. The United States adopted the .30-40 Krag as its service bolt action in 1892 and declared it obsolete by 1903, and the rifles poured onto the surplus market in enormous numbers at the exact moment the territory was filling with men who needed a rifle and had no money. Surplus dealers sold sporterized Krags for as little as $10 in the 1920s, and the smooth side gate magazine and the famously slick bolt made it a favorite of the men who had learned the rifle in the Army. Its weakness came north with it. The Krag locked with a single lug, and the single lug set a limit on what could safely be loaded into it, a limit that mattered when the animal in front of the muzzle weighed half a ton. The men who carried it accepted the terms, picked their shots, and kept the rifle anyway, because $10 settles. A lot of arguments about locking lugs. In the Tanana Valley in the 1930s, in cabin after cabin, the Krag was simply the rifle, sporterized in a shed with a hacksaw and a file. The military stock cut down. The history unmentioned. The Army had retired it. The territory had not. Number 6, the Savage Model 99. The Krag was the rifle a man bought when he had $10. The Model 99 was the rifle he bought when he had 20 and an opinion. It was a hammerless lever action with a rotary magazine set inside the receiver, and the magazine was the whole idea. With no cartridges stacked nose to primer in a tube, it could safely fire pointed bullets when every other lever gun in the country could not, and it shot flatter than any of them. Chambered in .303 Savage, and later in .250-3000 and .300 Savage, it gave a homesteader genuine reach across a river bar, across a burn, across the country where the shot is 400 yards and there is no closer. The price, about $20 in 1910, also bought a brass rotary counter set into the side of the receiver that showed exactly how many rounds remained. And in a country where a second shot decides things, that was a genuinely useful thing to know. In the foothills of the Alaska Range, the guides and market hunters, men who shot for a living and chose their tools accordingly, took the Model 99 over anything else on offer and kept them running for 50 years on a repair bill of a spring and a screw. Number 5. The Winchester Model 1886. It was John Browning's first great lever action and the strongest lever gun of the black powder era, built around the big cartridges .45-70, .45-90, .50-110. The rounds a man reached for when the problem was not filling a cache, but stopping something that had already decided to come. The men who paid its price, about $21 in 1890, were not settlers buying a first rifle. They were market hunters, packers, and the guides who took the first outside hunters into the Kenai and Kodiak for brown bear, men whose work put them close to the animal on purpose. In the years before smokeless powder reached the territory in quantity, the 1886 was the answer to the largest land predator in North America, and everyone who carried one into the alders knew exactly what the alternative was. The alder country of Kodiak and the Alaska Peninsula deserves its own sentence. Head-high brush, so dense a man parts it with his 4 arms, ground where every encounter happens inside 20 feet. Guides on that coast carried the 1886 into that brush after wounded bears, not ahead of the hunt, after the wound, when the animal knows the ground and the man does not. The rifle was chosen for the moment, when the distance was already gone. Number 4, the Winchester Model 1895 in .405. The 1895 was the last of the Browning lever designs, a box magazine rifle rather than a tube, and the only lever action strong enough for the new high-pressure smokeless cartridges. In .405 Winchester, it threw a 300-grain bullet hard enough that Theodore Roosevelt called it big medicine. The endorsement mattered commercially. But in Alaska, the rifle earned its reputation on its own terms, on the Bear Coast, where guides and homesteaders asked one specific thing of a firearm, that it break heavy bone on the first shot, because on that coast there was rarely time for a second. A new one cost around $25 in 1900, and the ammunition was expensive and hard to come by in the territory, a limit that kept the .405 in the hands of professionals rather than families, a working tool for men who were paid to stand between a client and a charge. For a generation of guides on the Alaska Peninsula, it was the standard answer to that charge, and the standard was not questioned. Then the bolt actions and the belted magnums arrived and quietly replaced it, without argument or announcement. The .405 went onto the wall, and the future went over the shoulder. Number 3, the Springfield 1903 and the .30-06. The Army's bolt action of 2 world wars carried with it the cartridge that became and remains the default rifle round of Alaska. Enough for moose at any sane range, enough for caribou, enough for bear, if the shooter is calm. Veterans brought them home from France in 1919 and from the Pacific in 1945, and walked them straight into the bush, and behind the veterans came the surplus market. 1903s and Model 1917S for a few dollars each, all the way through the 1950s. Its virtues were exactly the ones the territory rewarded. A strong action, iron sights that could not fog or break, a stock a man could replace himself at the cabin bench, and a cartridge sold in every roadhouse and trading post in Alaska. That last virtue was the decisive one, because a rifle chambered for a cartridge the country does not stock is a club with a sling. By the 1960s, on homesteads across the interior, the .30-06 was so universal that the word rifle meant nothing else. A man who said he was taking the rifle was never asked which one. A box of 20 cartridges was expected to last 3 seasons, in a country where every shot was fired for a reason. Number 2, the 12-gauge with slugs. It has been standing in this story since the first minute, the pump gun beside the door, a rifled slug in the chamber, buckshot behind it. And it stands at number 2 because more Alaskans have been saved by this loading than by any rifle ever made. The reason is distance. The bear at the salmon rack, the moose that will not leave the yard in the rut, the shape in the alders at 15 feet. None of these is a hunting problem, and at close range, a 1-ounce slug that a frightened shooter can put on target beats a rifle he cannot. The 12-gauge was also the affordable answer, and the 2 facts are one fact. The same gun that handled a charging animal had been shooting ducks and grouse all autumn, and a homestead that could afford exactly 1 firearm bought this one. In household after household, it became a fixed piece of furniture, loaded at freeze-up and unloaded at break-up. No more remarked upon than the stove. Some families kept the custom for 3 generations without once needing it. Some families needed it. The custom did not distinguish between them. The gun by the door was not a weapon a family used. It was a weapon a family kept, the way it kept the roof. Number 1, the Winchester Model 70 in .375 H&H. Introduced in 1936 and chambered for a British Magnum cartridge designed in 1912, it throws a 300-grain bullet through both shoulders of anything walking in North America. And it sits at the top of this list because it is the rifle that ends the argument. The reason is a single piece of steel. The controlled round feed claw extractor grips the cartridge rim the instant the round leaves the magazine and does not let go, so the rifle will feed while being worked upside down, half frozen, by a man who is not thinking clearly, and that is the exact condition in which a rifle is asked to matter. In the 1950s, a Model 70 cost about $130, several weeks of wages, and it became the standard by which Alaska guides were licensed and judged. The rifle a client was told to bring, and the rifle the guide carried behind him. On Kodiak, on the peninsula, in the Chugach, there were guides who carried the same Model 70 for 40 years and thousands of miles, who could recite the history of every mark on the stock, and who handed it to a son with the sights still set exactly where they had been in 1958. More than any other object on this list, it is the one Alaska families still have, still shoot, and still trust. The arrangement that hung all of this on cabin walls ended quietly, and it ended on paper. The Homestead Act was repealed for the rest of the country in 1976, and for Alaska in 1986, and the last homestead patents in America were signed in the Alaska interior at the end of the 1980s. Read the countdown back, and it makes a pattern that nobody who lived it would have bothered to point out. The tools at the top of the list were bought, ordered from catalogs, paid for in fur money and wages, shipped north in the holds of steamers. The tools at the bottom were made, cut from antler, spiraled from a green hide, ground from a broken saw blade at a cabin bench. The families who lasted were the ones who understood that the difference did not matter. An ulu, a snare of moose hide, and a bolt-action rifle are not three kinds of answer. They are one answer to one question, which is how to still be alive at breakup. On 1,000 Creeks, the cabins are going back into the muskeg now. It is slow work. The roof opens first, then the ridgepole, then the walls lean into the moss that has been waiting under them the whole time, until there is a rectangle of sunken green and a stand of young spruce and nothing else. But in the one still standing, the same rifle is on the same 2 nails over the door, oiled by somebody's grandson. The one object in the room that still looks the way it was made to look. It hangs pointed at a country that has not gotten any easier since. The snow still comes in October,